We'd like to thank GoDaddy, our sponsor for our podcast from Node.JS Interactive in Austin, Texas. You may know GoDaddy as a hosting company, but they also have a deep involvement in the Node.js ecosystem. You can learn more at GoDaddy.com. That's GoDaddy.com. GoDaddy.com. Hey, it's Alex Williams, the News Stack here at Node.js Interactive in Austin, Texas, and I'm joined by Darryl Taft, a longtime industry observer and veteran of this world, along with our guests, Emily Rose of Salesforce and Steve Kinney of the Turing School. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be here.
So I was just asking you, like, what would be some real themes and sub-themes to think about when discussing JavaScript and IoT, and what is that storyline that we're starting to see emerge? And I think that's the only way I can get my head around it, because, you know, we're talking about everything now, right? Any node you can possibly think of. It could be, you know, this table or, you know, the bottle or whatever it is, right? So I just would, you know, like, I just am interested in your guys' context about JavaScript and IoT. And Emily, you were talking about economies of scale and the processing power, and, you know, and that capability just alone.
Yeah, no, so as I was mentioning just before we started, just kind of like the way I see it is, you know, seeing kind of this, like I mentioned, like the economy of scale with regard to like processing power, and like it's much easier and cheaper now to manufacture fairly powerful, you know, microcontrollers and you know, systems on chips that that are capable of running, like, you know, V8 or JavaScript or you know, similarly, you know, languages that used to be, you know, prohibitive with the resources. And, you know, that coupled with JavaScript being, you know, in comparison to a lot of programming languages, very accessible. I think that's a really interesting, you know, kind of, I guess, aspect to explore, like a kind of a frame to look at it through, because I think that's really the two things that are powering this kind of very rapid-paced shift in how we're approaching computing.
Mm-hmm. So, Steve, so what's your perspective?
I think a lot about you think about like the open source like web movement, right? And like in 1993, 95, you wanted to make a web application. Well, you had to buy like a Oracle database, right? And like the barrier for entry for most people, you had to buy a compiler, right? The web got interesting when open source really took off, and anyone was able to kind of like, you can get Postgres and like download Rails and download a browser and stuff like that. And that's when the web got really interesting. And I think a lot about, we think about like IoT on like two levels, right? We think a lot about like, oh, my refrigerator has a computer in it now and a screen and stuff like that. And that's a thing, right? The part that excites me is the kind of like lowered barrier to entry, where you can buy, and you can get like an Amazon Dash button for like $5, and as soon as you hit it once, you get like $5 in laundry detergent. It's practically free, and you can hack that thing with JavaScript. And like the JavaScript part plays in for me because it is like the world's most popular programming language, and you have these tools, you know, like the idea of like designing your own hardware, like 15, 20 years ago, that's not a thing. Right. Like that's not a thing that the average person can go to, like, you know, some website, order a few like circuit boards and like start making stuff. Right. And like, you know, the things you would, you know, the barrier, like the knowledge barrier of entry, the cost barrier of entries and stuff like that are, as they remove, I'm interested to see not just like what like some large company does with their next tea kettle. I'm also interested to see what like the, you know, the everyday just hobbyist does with their tea kettle.
Right. Darryl, what do you think?
Well, I have to say, I'm interested in what Emily can tell me about what's Salesforce interest in IoT.
So I think, you know, from Salesforce's perspective, it's primarily just around facilitating the customer's success within the space of IoT. And so, you as far as I'm aware, and keep in mind, I'm relatively new to the company. I've only been with us for about 5 months. But what I see is primarily just kind of like a data source agnostic platform for that massive ingress and the processing and kind of like the mangling and munging of data that you need to do to get it into a form that's actually useful for you with regard to business objectives. And so what I see Salesforce doing is really just kind of positioning itself to be a platform where you can find success in IoT without having to invest all of the resources in really fully understanding the depths of IoT, right? We think of it as like this umbrella term of like, oh, the Internet of Things, but like, what does that really mean to the average person who's like, well, I have a business to run and I want to like accomplish things, right? And it's really, I think, when you look at businesses out there and how they're using it, it seems pretty clear that it's really about the interconnectedness of experiences, either for customers or for me, like as a hobbyist. That's really the core of what it is that I find exciting and interesting about IoT, is the idea that I can have this interconnectedness and a way of interacting with systems where I'm not always intentionally sitting down in front of a screen, devoting all of my time and attention to it so that it can do the things that I want it to do. Like, we're getting to that point now where automation and connected products and experiences are like attainable for so many of us. And so that's what I think is really interesting.
Okay. Now, I thought you were going to talk about a robot salesperson.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely an interesting thing to explore. As far as I'm aware, that's not something that's currently on the roadmap. But,
I hear you. Yeah. Thanks.
You know what I think, that idea of thinking about JavaScript and thinking about IoT in a hobby context is what's most fun, right? I mean, and in these early days, that to me is what makes it so exciting, right? So like, if you like look at other times where, I remember when I was just first discovering RSS, a while back, and in those days, Yahoo Pipes was the thing, right? And you can make all these different connectors, right? To get this incredible like granular information and make these discoveries. I mean, I remember hacking iTunes, with RSS. So like, you get random songs pulled into your iTunes feed. There's kind of a similarity in context, I think, with JavaScript and IoT. I mean, you think about, you were beatboxing before we started, and like, you could have like a talking fishes, on the beatbox by commanding it through some JavaScript command. I mean, that's the fun stuff about it, right?
Alexa, beatbox.
Yeah, Alexa.
Anyone
beatbox.
listening to this now?
Right.
Yeah, so I'm just curious on what are some of the threads you're starting to see, in that storyline, about what are the cool things that people are making that just make it fun and kind of extend the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, most of the stuff that like we play around with at Turing and stuff like that is definitely in the fun hobby level stuff. Right, that's the fun part about being a nonprofit, is you don't have to worry about business needs. As long as our students are learning stuff, we're doing a good job. But it is kind of interesting, like, I think the discovery aspect, I like how many of these, like, hey, weird side projects becomes a business that adds to like the GDP of this country, right? Like, and are we fully there? Like, how many of those exist right now? Maybe not that many, but like, if you follow the kind of like trend line and you look as Emily was saying with like, the economy of scale, like how many of those things begin to like appear? Like, I think we're still like very early days, right? But we have like prior art, I think, with like the web and like software to see when hobbyists and indie like developers can like begin to like try weird stuff out and like kind of like prove out different ideas, and like we have like experience to see where this could possibly end up. Is, I think, for me, is what makes it really exciting. If not, we have a really cool hobby.
So NodeBot, right? Isn't that a project that you started? There's a thread there, isn't there?
Yeah. So I mean, NodeBots was definitely a community effort. I was one of the folks kind of initially involved in its early stages, but it's since taken on a life of its own.
What is it? Tell us what it is.
So NodeBots, I think, is really primarily a concept, and it's just the idea of like, hey, like, let's build robots, or let's play with hardware using Node.JS. And I think like the first instance of it that I remember was with Daniel Shaw. He was at the time working at Voxer, and we put together like a hardware hack day where people just kind of came and built stuff and had fun. And one thing that I remember being particularly impressed and inspired by was a gentleman by the name of Max Ogden built a coffee roaster with a bread machine and a heat gun and Node.JS. And like then he roasted the coffee, and then we like ground it up and had French press like that day. And it was like the first time I had ever had like fresh roasted coffee turned into coffee. And it was just such a fun and interesting thing that it was like he was just solving like a need that he had. Like he wanted to be able to roast coffee and didn't necessarily want to like go and, you know, spend a ton of money on a coffee roaster. And he like managed to just like hack one together, and even built like a little interface for taking a look at like, you know, the temperature trends, and like, you know, just was thinking about like how you could, you know, record that and come up with different like roasting recipes and things like that. But yeah, NodeBots, you know, at these days I think is primarily just kind of this concept, and it, you know, there's like a you know, global like a, you know, NodeBots Day that happens internationally, and people all kind of get together around the same time and just hack in their own spaces throughout the world. But I think at its core, it's really just about it kind of showing people that the barrier to entry in this technology is much, much lower than even people who are familiar with technology expect, right? Like as web developers, we're really used to having a pretty significant upfront cost to invest in finding success in a technology. And with NodeBots, you know, the common story is that someone who literally never touched hardware before, within the span of a day, is finding success and feeling that feeling of like, you know, eureka, aha, I found something that I can do. And that's really inspiring to me.
My first experience with like NodeBots, I went to like just on a whim to a NodeBots meetup in New York City, and like someone handed me an Arduino and a LED, and I got it to blink. And you know what? Like I was a professional software engineer at the time. I can't even tell you how validating that was. Like the amount of like, oh my God, I made this like physical thing. Like it's not on a screen. I made this physical thing do a thing, and like I had that like level of success like 20 minutes in. Right, like, which is, you know, then I made it stay on, and it was just like, you know, there's, you know, the kind of like ease of entry, I think is like really amazing, and like, I think really powerful.
So, what projects are you guys working on now? Like Emily, for example, what are some of the things you're working on right now?
So right now I'm working on a project that is, I would say at this point, probably 90% just kind of like culture and kind of thinking around what the future of computing looks like. But our next step is to try to use, you know, the unprecedented access that we have to technology and information to build a system that could help us learn and teach each other about empathy and compassion. And so that's really like my personal angle of IoT is that, you know, this is kind of just like the burgeoning beginnings of the next generation of computing, where we're no longer going to be always, like I mentioned earlier, like sitting, what I call the eyeball fingertip feedback loop, right? Like that is a way of the past, largely. And the further that we get there, the closer that we get to that, the more opportunities it will have to, you know, share data in a meaningful way and responsibly, and learn about each other and ourselves, and really break down a lot of the barriers that we've had to, you know, our abilities to you know, express compassion towards each other. So I know that was probably not what you're expecting, but that's what I'm working on.
But it's something we could totally use.
Absolutely.
How about you?
So right now, you know, kind of as we start up like our front end program, kind of trying. I have, you know, it's interesting to see like students naturally gravitate to it. Like we had, you know, another like kind of member of the NodeBots team, or the loose Federation, Cassandra Perch came out to Turing to kind of like introduce like a bunch of our students to like NodeBots, right? And, you know, we do these self-directed projects like kind of as they're like, you know, 3/4 of the way through the program, and we had a student that like started building with you know with a web interface and a node server and a bunch of hardware, this entire like soil monitoring system for his home garden that he's like turning into a project, right? And it's like trying to like build up the community in Denver around that, to kind of like to have those people working together. Personally, like the next project I want to work on is I want to get a weather balloon and like get a bunch of hardware like a GPS and a cell signal so I can figure out where this thing is, and a little camera. And with a weather balloon, you can get up to the stratosphere and you can like take
Wow.
pictures of the curvature of the Earth and space, right? And
Yeah.
like I always wanted to do this when I was in New York City, except there's a bunch of reasons why you can't do it in New York City. One, people don't like you flying random objects over Manhattan. Two, the Atlantic Ocean, right? But in Colorado, I can do this now. There's nothing but Great Plains to the east if you follow like the wind patterns, and kind of like building like really interesting things like that. So like my student Jeff's, that's a practical thing that he's trying to like build into a product. Mine is more just like fun and experimentation and like running around with my 4-year-old looking for the thing. So.
But there's an interesting kind of contrast too, where we're we're facing a new brave world in many respects, right? That's in some respects empty of compassion in many ways, and that's often done through disinformation, right? And using machines to create disruption, right? But developers don't usually think about security as their first kind of as the first thing in mind. They're trying to create things. That's part of the fun. That's part of the innovation and the creativity. But now we're in kind of in different times, and I'm curious on your guys' perspective on that. As you think about what you need to think about with JavaScript, what do you need to think about with just the any endless number of modules out there that are available, like third-party JavaScript, attacks and everything else, and how does that play into your context about this kind of this time where we are thinking about the hobbyist culture, but there's so many other different vectors.
Someone hacks your website, you have a bad day. Someone hacks your heat ray. You're going to learn all about security real fast.
Yeah, I mean, I think that from my perspective, fortunately, over my time, just exclusively in the Node community, I've seen a pretty marked increase in security awareness within the community. So when I started writing Node, there was really no structured initiative toward addressing security concerns. Since then, there's been the folks at Anyet built Lyft. There's the Node Security Project. There's SNCC. There's a few others. I'm sure I'm forgetting. NodeSource just released certified modules. I mean, there's so much more available to you now that I'm definitely encouraged by that, and I feel like the trend is pretty strong.
Yeah.
So I'm not not a security expert by any means, but I am someone who does try to think about security implications as I'm building something.
So how do you do that? Like just as a person who doesn't know necessarily, is in researching security or a security expert inside of a company, how do you think about it?
So I think it's kind of like it's twofold. There's one from what I guess I would just label like the technical perspective of like making sure that you're not making yourself vulnerable to XSS attacks or SQL injection or Mongo injection or various attacks like that. And then the other side of it is kind of more of like the cultural impact of like how can the technology that you're building be used for a destructive means rather than what you intend it to do. And so I think increasingly as we enter into this era of IoT, we'll be focusing more on that of managing the risk inherent in the technology itself rather than the implementation details.
I get to cheat insofar that I like train developers and put out another batch every few months, which is that we just put security and accessibility and other things that I think haven't always been given the attention they deserve into our curriculum. So my hope is like by writing really fantastic curriculum and stuff like that, like that we can like keep producing more people that like take security and again I think accessibility and a bunch of these other like factors as like a like table stakes.
So
right.
So what are you writing into the curriculum?
I mean, we teach it directly. Then there's also me just trolling them and breaking into their apps and script injecting them for fun. But like making it like a thing. Like this is not a thing unless like you've taken taken all of users and like their security like as a concern, right? So either by like directly teaching these things, by like making them like kind of like requirements for every like project that they turn in and stuff along those lines, right? And thinking about these things as like things that they take for granted. I think like a similar thing happened with like testing, right? Like years ago, right? Where it's like testing became a thing that like you were expected to have, right? And like there's lots of really great reasons. In the same way, there's really great reasons for security and accessibility, right? But now it is part of like what is expected of a professional level web application, right? And I think as we, as we get more formalized, I think about like teaching this stuff, right? Like you think about like prior to like programs like Turing and others, there wasn't really like a way that like you could get a computer science major. It didn't mean you knew anything about web development, right? And most of us, at least in the web development, computer science or not computer science, like are to a certain degree self-taught, and we're able to like pick and choose where we wanted to like focus our attention and like foster some really nasty habits, and like blind spots, right? And I think like as we kind of like get better at that, like I hope that we have like a lever that we can pull to like address these things with like the people coming into the community, which I don't know how true this is, but I at one point heard that at any given point, at the rate our industry grows, half of all developers are junior developers. Right, and so like, in some amount of time, half of like there will be twice as many developers and there'll be juniors. By getting better at like the education even coming in, we will drastically shape the overall like community really quickly.
Interesting. Darryl, any thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to NodeBots and ask Emily, is Steve's reaction, is that typical? Was that what you guys were shooting for when you...
Yeah, I mean, I've seen, I mean, I don't want to like mislead the audience and act like, oh yeah, everyone who goes to NodeBots is like, they never face any frustration. Yeah, but like, I mean, there's definitely obstacles to overcome, just like learning anything. But I will say that in my experience, the vast majority of people who participate do find success, and at the very least, in the conversations that I've had with them, seem to be very encouraged by their what they've learned through the various workshops and just hack days that I've been a part of. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely challenges. Hardware, I used to say in a lot of the talks, I'm like, I'm doing this because like a lot of people think hardware is hard, but that's not really the case, and that's kind of not true. I mean, it is still difficult sometimes when you're interacting with a device that only has like a couple buttons and an LED, and there's no screen to tell you exactly what the problem is. Mm-hmm. But with the advent of Arduino and like how almost anything you want to interact with is already in an integrated circuit, and uses something like SPI or I2C as a communication protocol where you don't have to worry about all the low-level stuff, that's really taking away a lot of the stumbling blocks that you would previously have experienced.
Mm. So, are there particular frameworks or tools that you find are gaining momentum when people are thinking about JavaScript and IoT?
I think in just Node.JS and the module ecosystem, NPM. Mm-hmm. I would be remiss to not mention Johnny 5, which has been huge in the NodeBots community.
What is Johnny 5?
So Johnny 5 is basically, the analogy I make is it's like the jQuery of hardware.
Mm-hmm.
It allows you to instantiate hardware objects very easily. So for example, instead of having to work, turn an LED on a very low level, being like, oh, what digital write shall I send on a pin? You simply go, hey, I have a new LED and it's on pin 5, and now you can do things like LED.on, .off, .strobe, .fade. And so it just adds a much kind of higher level way of reasoning about the components that you're working with. And there's an ever increasing library of code for components that exist out there. And you can say, oh, I've got like I think it's like the ping module. It's like the HCSR04 ultrasonic sensor, which is really popular. And you can literally just go new .ping, 5
Mm-hmm.
.ping, and like now you can take ultrasonic measurements of things around you without even. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I think the unsung hero of the Johnny 5 2 is the documentation, right? So not only is there a library where we can just get this pin, you can actually like you have some piece of hardware that you bought, whether it's a proximity sensor or whatever, right? You go to the Johnny 5 website. Not only is the code for how to like program, right? And so, hey, I got this new like sensor, LED, anything, right? There's not only just how you work with it in JavaScript, but like how you wire it up, like what kind of resistor it needs, all those things are like this really great community resource around this really great kind of like technology for working with this stuff.
Good documentation's hard to find.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you all for taking some time to talk today. It's been a wide-ranging discussion, but I think at this time of the, this time I think we, need to have these kinds of conversations. I'd love to explore more, Johnny Five, for example, and take a deeper look at something like that. But thank you for sharing your guys' knowledge.
Oh,
and
I had
insights.
one more.
Oh, you do? Good.
Yeah,
Okay.
Right.
I noticed that you were involved with or affiliated with something called Dance.js.
Yes.
And what is that?
So it starts with a story, and I'll try to make it fairly brief. But a couple years back at NodeConf US, I was talking to the organizer, Michael Rogers, and was just kind of expressing my desire to do something a little bit different this time, and not just do a workshop and not just give a talk, but something more collaborative and interactive. So we were just kind of like, I was throwing some ideas at him, and I'm like, well, I've been kind of working on this idea of an interactive real-time rave experience for nerds, and getting them in an environment where they feel comfortable and safe to like actually dance and hang out and express themselves in ways that you don't normally see software developers doing. And so he was really supportive and was like, here's a budget, go like figure out how you can like build basically like a rave experience at NodeConf. And so I did that, and turns out you can buy a rave on Amazon. Things like sound mixer, subwoofers, all that sort of stuff, speakers, glow sticks, and candy, very important.
Mm-hmm.
And we did that, and it all kind of started just from me doing. I had been doing presentations where I'm like, hey, look, I'm using JavaScript and some sensors, and you can upload music and you can play it and you can dance around in front of the sensors and it changes the colors and like the pace of the strobe and stuff like that. And I had wanted to kind of take that into a collaborative space, and so it's something that we're still kind of playing with. It spun off into Dance.js, which is something that happens semi-regularly, I think, in Oakland, and there's been a couple, and I think there's been one in Vancouver. I went up to Ireland and hosted one there for NodeConf EU just in October. It's just basically, long story short, it's just my pet project of getting software developers kind of out of their element and having fun with electronic music and interactive dance experiences.
I love it.
Having
yeah.
attended Dance.js, it needs to be experienced to be fully understood.
We have a pancake robot, and we have these pancake breakfasts we do at different events. We should have pancake JS or something.
Mhm.
Yeah, we could
With
like
Dance JS.
just
Yeah.
add some
Like
strobes and some
pancakes
color
and
gels.
dancing. I mean, come on.
Some
Yeah.
heat rays.
Yeah.
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
Like, I think we can tie almost everything in this conversation together into
Yeah.
one event.
Yeah, I'm down.
I'm down.
Let me
All
know.
right.
Let's do it.
Thanks for the last question, Darryl.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
You bet. We'd like to thank GoDaddy, our sponsor for our podcast from Node.js Interactive in Austin, Texas. You may know GoDaddy as a hosting company, but they also have a deep involvement in the Node.js ecosystem. You can learn more at GoDaddy.com. That's GoDaddy.com. GoDaddy.com.